This is Dain Saint, and you're listening to Pixelated Audio episode 143, featuring the music of Splice.
Welcome to Pixelated Audio, a podcast focusing on game audio, its history, and the people behind it.
Yes, today we're going to be playing music from a game that was released way back in 2012, titled Splice. We're your hosts. I'm Brian, this is Gene, and joining us to talk about the music is the game's composer and technical director, Dain Saint. Great having you. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. That track that brought us in was the intro track called Barachiel, composed by Dain Saint, and this is just a beautiful way to start out this episode. I absolutely love this track. This whole soundtrack is wonderful.
Thank you.
When Brian introduced me to this soundtrack, I didn't really know what to expect, and it's just full of these just rich, beautiful piano themes, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly since. And this track in particular, I think, is a little, I don't know, almost ominous. It's sort of,
yeah, it's kind of
yeah.
It's kind of got this this dark side to it, I think, too. It's like a dark beauty, I guess. Really like it. So real quick, Splice is a puzzle game that takes place in what appears to be almost like a petri dish or something as you rearrange and splice cells into targets, which within like a certain number of moves, I guess if you can get it in there, you move on to the next one and so forth. It was released in June of 2012 for Windows and Mac through Steam, and later for iPad and Android. And then in 2015, it was released for PlayStation 3 and 4 via PSN, both published and developed by Cipher Prime. Now, Cipher Prime was created in 2008 by technical director Dain Saint and creative director William Stallwood, and they've released nearly 10 or so games at this point, I believe, and have won numerous awards. We want to talk more about Cipher Prime shortly, but first, Dain, let's start with your background in music and also what led you into game audio.
Well, music's been a part of my life since I was a kid. My whole family is from Jamaica, and when I left kindergarten, my parents sent me down to stay with my grandparents for a while. And while I was down there, my grandfather, who was the organist for the church, he sat me down in front of the piano and taught me how to play. So that would have been around, kindergarten, first grade, something like that. So I've always had music in my life and had it as a path of expression. Never really thought it would be a profitable thing. And so it's always been kind of on the side. But when, fast forwarding a lot from first grade, when we started Cipher Prime, Will and I were sort of just looking for ways to work together. We had both been doing interactive media for a little while, and we each had our individual portfolios, but together we didn't have anything. So we decided, well, let's make something together. That became Auditorium, which came out in 2008. And since we were just like trying to create something beautiful and create something that would generate some business and some attention for us, we just kind of went all out. I got to dust off my keyboard, bring out some loops that I had been working on for a while, and from there we kind of fell into games, and as our composer I fell into game audio.
Awesome. Now you talked about being really into music when you were in kindergarten, first grade. What was your instrument of choice? Like what stuck with you through the years? Because, you don't just pick up a piano and start being awesome. Like, you must have had a transitional phase, or you must have gone through different instruments or what have you over the years. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, piano is still I would consider my main instrument. It's what I work out my ideas on, at the very least. I took some lessons. As far as say 7th and 8th grade was when I was really like taking lessons. But I've always been more of a play by ear or improvisational composer. I didn't even start learning, what's considered to be the normal or the standard music theory stuff until we were working on Fractal, and we were creating a audio engine that could sort of improvise based on what you were doing, and I had to figure out, well, how am I going to teach the computer how to do music stuff? And that's when the music theory stuff became really useful. But for me, I'd always sort of compose based on feel and mood and color, rather than, this is an A sharp minor 7 and it has to go to like. I can talk about things like that now, but it still feels very rigid for me. But yeah, piano has stuck with me my entire life. 7th and 8th grade was when I did the most of my formal training, and then more on my own as I got deeper into composing for games. Throughout high school, I was playing bass. In college, I was playing bass and guitar, and then after college, I took up singing. So that's kind of the gamut for my instruments.
Awesome. We talked to other people in the past who have mentioned not having a formal background actually led them down a very different creative path in their composition style and what freedoms it actually allowed, rather than being set in stone for certain ideas and maybe methodologies for their music. We also mentioned in past episodes, like there was a pivotal point in their career, in the composer's career, that after learning some of these foundational or more intricate theory or composition theory, that their style had changed. Did you notice any change in your composition when you got more down in the depths of the music theory side of stuff?
I wouldn't say that my style changed drastically so much as, one, I was able to better communicate to other musicians things that I had always done instinctually, which is great when you actually want to, collaborate with people. And then also it gave me another lens to look at something. And I sort of just creatively, I consider myself to be a collector of lenses. And that really helps when I hit a creative block and it's like, I don't know where to go with this, before I might listen to another piece that has the feeling that I want, or I might, take a trip, go to the museum and see if there's any sort of inspiration there. And now that I do understand music theory a bit better, I can say, okay, well, maybe there is a turnaround in music theory that would fit here. It just gives me more things in the toolbox. And I still don't, it's still not foundational for me. It's still kind of like a appetizer or a side. It's like fries, for the main entree of my composition. But it's nice knowing that I have it there when I want it.
Yeah,
that's excellent.
It's not actually terribly surprising. We've talked to so many composers on this show, and there's something about the creative and production side of video game music that it just attracts people from all different walks of life. I think we probably have more people that have said they didn't start knowing or learning composition until after they kind of were already doing it for a while, as opposed to people that had that more formal training. So I think you're in pretty good company.
Right.
And you do feel somewhat strange about it. You feel a little embarrassed, like, oh, I don't know this terminology and these things that everybody knows. But as you get older, and it's, especially for me, as I got older and I started really looking into the origins of things and understanding, like, oh, we talk about music theory as if it's complete, as if that is what music theory is, and we don't really stop to think about the deeply European perspective of what music theory is. It doesn't include anything from Asiatic perspectives, doesn't include anything from African perspectives. It's very much like the compositional styles of Western European classical composers. It's actually a lot more narrow than people sort of give it credit for.
That's a good point.
It expanded a lot also over the 20th century with the black music traditions, jazz and bebop and the rest. They really played with and expanded upon that. But I used to feel like I was really missing something, not having it. And as I've gotten a chance to work with more musicians and sort of deepen my musical composition ability and really appreciate things from other cultures, I realized that it's not as foundational as I thought it was. It's definitely more of a cultural thing than something that's strictly necessary.
You're the first person to bring that up, and that's a really good point. I'm glad you did, because one thing that I think everybody experiences one point or another in their life is the imposter syndrome. Like everybody's a big time composer, and I just did this stuff. I don't have any formal background, but I think you fake it till you make it is like a real thing. And like, that's how, I got good at my trade. That's how Gene, I'm sure, has got good at his trade, just really like trying to learn by doing. And music is such an interesting art form because you can, like Gene was saying earlier, all walks of life, and, people can get into it and not have to be held down by some kind of preconception of, having a strong, composition degree or something like that. It's really awesome to hear you talk about that from your perspective. So thank you very much. Let's go ahead and jump into our next track here. This is called Gabriel, composed by Dain Saint for Splice. That was Gabriel, composed by Dain Saint for Splice.
Another great track. You know what? One thing that I noticed is what I was listening to this whole soundtrack is there are a lot of elements that you tend to reuse. There's generally arpeggiated figures in the right hand and some really heavy pedal tones and you know, bass notes. Now, all of the tracks definitely sound different from each other in the sense that they're unique compositions, but they all hold together as a single body. I'm curious, Dain, when you were composing it, were you thinking of it as writing a lot of tracks in the same style, or was it just sort of things that were coming to mind? How did you sort of organize what this ended up becoming in terms of the whole set of tracks?
Well, it's interesting for me because the way I write music for games is very different from the way that I write music for myself. I'll talk often about in my mind, the difference between art and design, where art is about expression and design is about communication. And for game music, for me, it's a lot more about on the design side. It's a lot more about the communication. So what I mean by that is, you know, these tracks, they're background music in a game. They have to do a very specific set of things. When you open up Splice, you're sort of floating backwards through this sort of liquid space until you pass the title screen, which says Splice, that you can then click on. And the moment that appears on the screen is always punctuated by that heavy bass note in the left hand. So when you listen to every track, you'll have that little ostinato that's starting, a little arpeggiated note, and then you get that heavy bass on the left. And that is always when you open the game where you would see the Splice main screen. So there's lots of little design elements like that where the music has to kind of fit into what the player is experiencing at that time. So as a result, like, yeah, as I was composing it, you know, there's different emotions and things that I want to communicate in each of the different pieces, but they do still need to hold together as sort of a cohesive unit. You know, you need, you know, basically when somebody is, you know, playing Splice, I want them to have a specific feeling, a specific ambiance. I want that feeling of sort of being the lone scientist working in the lab late at night, like that, you know, twilight hour. So it has a bit of that dark feel. It has a bit of that methodical feel.
I'm really glad that you said that, actually, because as soon as you said lone scientist working in a lab, like, I could picture it exactly just from hearing the music. Full disclosure, I did not play the game. I watched a couple of videos of it. It looked super interesting and very much like you had a very clear aesthetic in mind or a clear vision. I assume it would probably translate a little better to experience it, but I'd have to ask Brian his opinion when we get to that point.
Yeah, and you know, to be fair, I was the one that's told Gene, like, hey, you got to listen to the soundtrack, but he's been listening to the music of this for several months now, and I know you've definitely fallen in love with it because we're here today, obviously. So I do want to kind of back up. We talked about the company, your company. We just mentioned it, but Cipher Prime is an indie game studio based in Philadelphia. You guys worked on a number of games, including Fractal, Pulse, Intake, Auditorium, obviously Splice. So could you tell us about your company, Cipher Prime?
Yeah, so Cipher Prime, that was me and Will. We met at a party in Philadelphia. We were introduced by a mutual friend. And it was Smash for Shots was what we were doing. I think it was God, I don't remember which Smash Brothers had come out, but one of them had come out, and it was a sort of thing where every time you won a round, you had to take a shot of like box wine. So it was it was like a natural handicap situation, right? So, but we're plastered by the end of this thing. And yeah, we're just like, we're talking about interactive design, and, you know, he showed me his portfolio and I showed him mine, and that's not a euphemism for anything. It was just kind of a cool thing. It was like, hey, let's work together at some point. Didn't talk for months. And then I had been working with some dumb company in Jersey at the time, and that contract ended, and I had decided at that point I'm never going to work for another person ever again. So I decided, like, okay, I'm going to start a company, and we'll figure out what exactly is probably going to be interactive design. We'll figure it out. And then like the next day I get a call from Will like, hey, I just quit my job. Do you want to start a company? So after like our second meeting, we decided to start this company together, and we started off in interactive designs, ended up making games, and did it for like 10 or so years. We just released a game last year called Line Weight. So yeah.
Looks exciting. Looks really awesome. What's the significance of the name Cipher Prime?
Cipher Prime, that was a very, very, very fancy 0 and 1. We're talking about sort of like digital art. So a cipher being a code, or also standing for 0, a prime being, sort of first, and also the 1. So there's a lot of like hidden symbols. That was a me thing. I tend to pick a lot of like deeply. They try and pack a lot of symbols into the same words. And I don't think it always communicates, but it's kind of my jam.
Well, there's definitely a style that you guys have created with Cipher Prime. Like if you just look at the website and you go through the games, there's this, everything is unique, but it has a kind of ethereal feel to all of your games. They're very like bright colors, but then like get dark and have just different moods and different, it kind of reminds me of, we talked to the team that did Grease a long time ago. And what they were doing is they were painting this whole mood with art and music combined. And that seems like your guys' MO. That seems like what you guys have created with this company. It's just very, very heavy on creating a feeling and conveying that feeling to the player.
Yeah, that's kind of the central. I did a talk a few years back at NYU on experience design, and not in like the sort of lame Adobe XD side of things where it's just like, oh, how do people use your UI? And like, not that. How do you create something that's an experience? How do you take whatever medium you're in, whether it's games or an event or a book or whatnot? How do you take that and elevate it to an experience, to something that really sticks with somebody and creates a visceral emotional response? And that is really what we sort of have always sought to do with Cipher Prime. And that emotion can be very different. I always kind of joke with Splice and I believe is the next game, Intake. The central shape in both of those games is just like a standard Unity capsule, and they're very different games. Splice is very meditative puzzle game, unlocking the secrets of life kind of situation, and then Intake is you're doing Molly in the bathroom at a Skrillex show. Like, it's a very different emotion.
Oh, that's great.
And so you go from this like Philip Glass soundtrack to like a dubstep soundtrack, and it's the same company, but it's just trying to give you that experience that is a bit more distilled.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think that comes across. Although I feel like I just had this weird sense of deja vu because I could have sworn Philip Glass came up in another show, completely unrelated. But
I think so.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this. Go on. What were you going to say?
Oh yeah, Philip Glass was a huge influence for the Splice soundtrack. He definitely the way he thinks about rhythm and overlapping rhythm and ostinatos and figures like that really inspired me to think about like sort of creating this very mathematical sounding soundtrack in a sort of way. And the one we just listened to, Gabriel, is probably the one that most directly references Philip Glass. That one was inspired by Metamorphosis 1. And if you pull them up, you'll hear like some of the same kind of figures in there. That I just wanted to at least give a musical shout out there in the soundtrack.
Well, I think a lot of people have like taken idea and influence from Philip Glass because it's one of the most influential American composers, I think, for the modern day. So, yeah,
It's true, and especially for the really high-minded video game music composers, you're definitely not the first to have made that connection. And I don't mean that in a bad way, by the way. I do appreciate it. Like, actually, one thing I wanted to mention, there's a designer that I'm really inspired by who works at Stanford, whose name is Ge Wang. That's G-E. He's kind of like a musician, designer, composer, but his whole thing is basically mirroring what you said. It's not enough to be art or design. There's this kind of like sense of beauty, of like meaning that is, if it's not there, you're just creating like product essentially. And I think that really comes across from what I've seen of your work up to this point. And, I really want to check out Line Weight and some of the other games that you've made. And, this is going to be kind of a long question, but I'm curious to know this here. So Cipher Prime, is based in Philly, which isn't the first city you think of when you think of game development. And you personally have done a lot to build up the scene, a lot like I mentioned Ge Wang before. You've held events, game jams, dev nights, Unity user groups. What was it like being such a foundational part of the community and building it up, not just like being a developer, but being so influential in the scene?
I think about sort of that last decade. It's kind of a blur. We're definitely always just like kind of running on to the next thing. And, I don't know that I really got, a chance to take a step back and really look at things until, we closed the Game Forge. That was, which is not sort of, I guess, where to start the story at the end, right? But we had spent a lot of time, trying to build up the scene and getting Dev Night together, getting the Game Forge together, and making games and making money off of it is not an easy thing. And at the time, trying to both run a co-working space and trying to run our company was just a lot. And so a lot of my memory of that time, there's so many good memories. There's so much life and heart in the space that we had created, and so many amazing experiences. But it really didn't hit me until when we finally made the decision to close the Forge, and we had our closing party, and I got a kind of chance to just like get out of mission mode. I'm very much like my dad in that way, where like if there's just things going on, you're just like you get up and you work, and then you go to sleep, and then at some point you'll remember what you did. And then and for me that was very much like, oh, I can kind of take a moment to really look at all of these like bright young faces, all of these people that like started, one of my favorite bits was, you guys know Greg Lobanov?
Yes. I'm trying to remember. You tell us. You're the game dev.
yeah. That's Dumb and Fat Games, right? He did.
Did he do Wander Song? I think.
Yeah, Wander Song, and the one that
right.
he's working on.
A great game. I loved it. Yeah.
Phenomenal, right? And he had actually applied to intern with Cipher Prime when he was a student at Drexel, and we said no because we weren't taking on interns at that time. And because Greg is super Philly, he said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my own company and intern for myself, which is how that company started. And he worked out of our space. We didn't have the bandwidth to intern him, but he just worked around us and blew past, like amazing developer, just an incredible knack for everything. And so like there's 100 of these tiny little stories that came out of the time of like our heavy involvement in Dev Night and Game Forge that like I still just think about like what that influence is like. So I don't know. That's it's gonna take me a while still, I think, to really get a sense of how influential that space was. But I just remember it fondly.
Yeah,
that's excellent.
And the best thing about that really is that the community has still survived and flourished. You know, Dev Knight was started by my partner Will and this dude Sean Pierre, who is like just the nicest, most amazing human being you'll ever meet. Like, there's not a single bad thing I can say about this dude. And you know, he and the rest of the community really stepped up, and Dev Knight ended up becoming Philly Game Mechanics, which is this like really great nonprofit in Philadelphia that's still fostering game development, still fostering these independent spirits, still hosting game jams. And, you know, through multiple venue changes and the pandemic and the shift to like everything being virtual, they're still just keeping that fire lit, you know, for the game scene in Philadelphia. And you know, every time I see something come by from them, I'm always like just really happy to see it continuing on, and just really grateful that I had any small part in helping that community just at least get a start. You know, the having had any part to play in that, I'm tremendously proud.
That's awesome. I do want to take another music break here. This next track is called Eremiel, composed by Dain Saint for Splice.
That was Eremiel, composed by Dain Saint for the game Splice.
This might be my favorite track in the soundtrack. And I wish I would have said this on the last track, but like, I really like bouncing between that kind of dark minor chord progression and then going into the beautiful kind of almost like playful major chord. It's so beautiful and gives me chills just listening to it.
Thank you.
I actually think I prefer Barachiel a little bit better, but this is a beautiful track as well. I think that one hits me in a slightly different way. There's some emotional like lows and highs, if you will, that kind of, I mean, everybody responds to music differently. I'm not saying anything about this track that I dislike. It's more like, I think that one kind of resonated with me more. You know, I think you said it yourself. A lot of this music is very emotional and personal, and it's meant to kind of elicit a certain mood, and they're not all quite in that same space.
I bet you if you asked me in a few weeks from now, I might even give you a different answer. So,
yeah, but with the permanence of recording, now people are going to think that that's our answer forever.
That's forever. So, Dain, tell us about Eremiel.
Eremiel It's a sort of a, I wanted that to have a more playful and happy feel to it, because it's kind of situated in a part of the game where things are starting to get a lot more difficult. And that's one of the things that I was really keeping in mind with the soundtrack. And one of the reasons that soothing was always the adjective that came to mind, was that Splice is hard. It's a really hard game.
It's really hard. It's really hard.
It's really hard. It's pretty unforgiving. I mean, you're able to scrub back and forth within a single puzzle, but like if you don't get that puzzle, you're not moving on. And I wanted people to have that, level of frustration, because that's the same thing that I feel when I'm trying to figure out a problem or I'm solving a computing issue or like anything like that. You get into that level of frustration because then when you get it, when you solve the puzzle after that, there's this immense feeling of like release. And you just want people to stick with it long enough to get that feeling, right? And Eremiel is positioned at a part of the game where we've kind of taught you all the major mechanics, and now we're putting everything together, and you have to really start thinking about what actions you want to take. So I did want it to have sort of all the pieces are coming together kind of feeling. This is, when you hear the second round of the I guess what you would call a verse come in, it's the same thing as before, but with just more moving up and down the console, up and down the keyboard. So you wanted to have that sort of feeling of, okay, all the pieces are starting to come together, all the pieces are starting to fit, and it feels good.
I love that. So, Gene, you brought something up earlier that I wanted to also make a mention of. I think
symbolism. I think we need to bring up the angel in the room, because there's a lot of symbolism in the music. So, for those of you who are following along, the albums on Bandcamp are called Flight of Angels, and then the sort of part 2 album is called Algorithms and Angelology. And in this first one, I believe all of them are angels or archangels. There's got to be some reason for that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of those, 10,000 symbols crammed into the same space things that I like to do. So the whole feeling that we wanted to get, right, was that not only that you were a scientist working in a lab late at night, trying to sort of unlock the secrets of life or whatever, but really trying to hone in that feeling of like you are playing in God's domain. You are doing something that is a little beyond what you should be doing, and maybe you shouldn't be doing it. We really wanted to get that feeling in there, and so the main each sequence, right, of which there are 7, has 7 strands in it. When you complete the game, you finish the first 7 sequences, and then you go to the epilogue, which is another 4, right? So if you have the total of that's 11 sequences of 7 strands apiece. So you have 77 levels in the game. Geez. So that number 7 is in there over and over and over again. And then even
I just thought this was all about splicing like corn and making like GMO versus non-GMO soybean products.
Yeah, we always sort of put a bit more like emphasis on like our side of like making sure we're clear on what we want to communicate, but then it doesn't come out in the text. It's all subtext. My favorite little bit of it actually is that in the scale there are 7 white keys, right? Mm-hmm. So if you do an octave, you're going from C to C, but you drop off that last C, it goes from C to B. And if you look at the track listing for Flight of Angels, it starts off in B with Barachiel, and then it goes to A, Ariel, G, Gabriel, all the way down to C, Cassiel. So it's even calling into play the the 7 that's intrinsic in music theory. So there's that number 7 showing up over and over and over again.
Wow.
If
that's
you look
awesome.
for it. Yeah.
That's wild. We knew there was a lot more to it.
I noticed the alphabetical thing, but somehow I didn't draw the connection to the keys on a keyboard, but I probably should have.
Yeah.
Although now that I know you, I'll assume that everything you say is laden with double meaning.
that is an accurate assessment. You should definitely do that.
Well, let's get into our next track here. This is you might have to pronounce this, Dain. Darda'il. Darda'il.
Yeah.
Our next track, Darda'il. It's composed by Dain Saint for Splice.
That was Darda'il, composed by Dain Saint for the game Splice.
This track always reminds me of like the sun parting between like the rain clouds. There was a movie that immediately comes to mind, or it was like a short story adaptation to a movie or something called All Summer in a Day. I think it's like from like the 80s where I guess like a family or a girl or something lives on, I want to say another planet like Mars or something, and the sun only comes out once every 7 years, and like that is like the day that all the flowers bloom and everything like that. This is the track that is that soundtrack in my head for that that plot, I guess.
There's that number 7 again.
Oh, you want to talk Philip Glass? I immediately got Koyaanisqatsi, like flashbacks to. I've watched that movie. Has been a long time, but it definitely is a little darker, a little bit more like kind of going back to what you were saying about meddling with life and doing things that you shouldn't be doing. That's basically the entire premise of that film. Is humanity itself is maybe going too far, and that was in the 80s, and we've only gone further since.
Dain, tell us about Darda'il.
Yeah, Darda'il is a kind of a dark track, and it's almost purposefully dark and methodical, to contrast with Cassiel that comes at the end of this, which is a lot more fast paced and sort of triumphant. Darda'il, I consider Darda'il to be the theme of Splice. We used it in the trailer. We used it in a few different places. There's you don't hear it as strongly in the game in this track, but if you go and listen to if you watch the trailer, you'll hear the sort of main motif that I associate with just the game in general, which is sort of a bittersweet, major to minor movement that's happening in that main motif, and I love it. It was one of the ones that I had the easiest time playing because I spent a lot of time with it. The whole soundtrack is not meant to be played with two hands. It's meant to sound like it can be played with two hands, but it really can't. It's composed for four hands, which is another one of those trying to give you a sense that, hey, maybe this is a little bit beyond human ability, and a nod to it's also a nod to Gattaca.
Right.
Yeah, there was a piano player in Gattaca that had 6 fingers on each hand, and the composer wrote a piece that had extra notes put into it to give you the sense that you need 12 fingers to play this, and it's just a little off. So that's kind of where I took that inspiration from. But Darda'il was always the one that I had the easiest time playing as if I could actually manage on two hands.
Well, that brings me to another question, actually. I want to ask about your composition process. When you want to create music for one of your titles, what goes through your head? How do you get yourself in that mood and actually start writing something down?
It really depends. It depends a lot on the game and the mood and the time constraints, which I always had time constraints. There was always Splice. I had a decent amount of time to work on, but then a game like Shim Sham, we did this small game for Leap Motion when that first came out. I think we recorded that album and wrote and recorded that album in 2 days. That was all we had in the budget.
Wow.
So it's one of those sort of things where it's cool, being the technical director and being responsible for actually programming a lot of these subsystems. But you spend most of your time doing that. I don't have a lot of time to do the soundtrack. So I got very cutthroat with how I did my game music. A lot of constraints, knowing I was going to do 7, knowing that I was going to stick to this, seeing the number 7 come up again, it struck me on that the keys, okay, well, this first one is in B, we have to do 7, let's go from B down to C. Now I know the keys I have to compose everything in, and I just have to compose one for each. So it gives me sort of a way to backfill in what I need to create. And then, for Splice, it was a lot of just looking at the game and having the we have the ambiance sound from a submarine, I think is what we ended up going with for the game, to give you that deeply underwater feel. And I would just sort of put that on and stare at the game and pick out ostinatos until I got something that made me want to play a bit more, and then I would just start layering on top of that until I got to something that I enjoyed. Darda'il, when I first wrote it, was a lot more dynamic. It was a lot heavier of a piece, but since again that goes into Cassiel, which is the most dynamic track, I think, at least on the Flights of Angels, I went back and sort of re-recorded Darda'il to be a little bit more meditative and a little bit mellower, so that there would be more contrast going into that final piece.
Excellent. Well, that leads us into our next track, which is Cassiel, composed by Dain Saint.
Well, this is Cassiel, or that was Cassiel, and this is my favorite song out of all 11 tracks. I love this one so much. This was the single that we released when we announced the game. It just has so much life and energy, and I was surprised by this track when I wrote it.
You know, I was gonna say, I know I said earlier that I really liked Eremiel, and then I listened to this again. I'm like, I don't know. This is kind of I'm feeling it right now. That when that first deep note comes in on the left hand, it just, oh man, my arm hair just kind of stands up on end. It's so awesome.
Oh yeah,
it's a really beautiful track.
I mean, this one was a must listen. Like, all of the elements hit just right. You've got that sort of melodic elements that are going to come crashing into like a big chord, and it's absolutely one of my favorites on the first half, 2/3. The first 7 tracks. There's that you mentioned. There's the epilogue chapter, but this is the main game. Absolutely love this track, and I'm glad that we're able to have you on to talk about it.
Yeah, this is I was surprised by this one, and I think it was one of those things where you're playing and you decide to make a decision that you wouldn't normally make. And I don't have the music theory to explain the decision, but going from it's written in C, and so going from there into the chorus is just such a huge shift from this like really like tightly constrained minor feel to this big open like angelic major chord. I think I go to the 4. I think I go from C to F. And it just always hits. It always hits every time I hear it. And I was surprised by it when I did it, because I wasn't planning on it. And so when I go back and listen to it, I'm just like, yeah, that sounds good.
Wow.
That sounds really nice.
I did good. Yeah.
Happy accidents.
Right. Happy little clouds, right?
You're such an interesting guy. Like when we started listening to the soundtrack, we didn't know like really what to expect. I hadn't heard your music prior to this game. And so we're like, like let's look into the soundtrack a little more. Let's look into this composer, Dain Saint. Who's that? Okay, well let's go to the website. And you're such an interesting person. Like you have art and activism and all sorts of poetry, books, music. Everything you've done has these very like deep messages. And we were kind of hoping that you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, where to start? So for
I mentioned
me,
a lot of things in there. Yeah.
Yeah. That's always been sort of a point of contention for me, because I find that much in the same way that like I don't really pay attention to music theory. I just kind of write music that sounds good and feels good to listen to, and then if you want to apply music theory to it afterwards, yeah, sure. I kind of feel that way about all of my art. I don't really care about the medium so much as the message. And so, one of the benefits one of the reasons I really loved working in games for so long was that it really forces you to be a bit more limber about how you exercise your creativity, especially in a small company like Cipher Prime, where on any given day I could be, working on a particle system or creating a messaging system, writing music, doing sound effects, doing visual effects, doing our taxes, talking to the accountant. Like there's just so much going on. You can't afford to consider all of those jobs to be separate, or you'll lose your mind. And that's kind of how I feel about my art. It very much speaks to a lot of that. The books and poetry and short stories and videos or whatever, they're all kind of different expressions of the same sort of underlying thing. And I kind of refer to all of that as sort of my tapestry. Like there's a million little threads, but they all, for me at least, form sort of one cohesive picture. And I haven't yet gotten to the point where I am able to communicate the entire tapestry to people. And so I'm sort of I have to content myself with showing little patterns and little threads here and there until the picture comes together.
That's awesome. I do want to bring up a music video that you just released a few weeks ago that I watched last night actually for the first time, and I was really impressed. It's called let me see. It's called Can't Speak. No, hold on. What's it called?
City Don't Sing?
City Don't Sing. I was going to say City Don't Speak, but that's not it. It's called City Don't Sing. Could you tell us about this song and this music video?
Yeah. So 2020. You remember 2020?
I'd rather forget, to be perfectly honest. But yes, we were there for most of it.
Yeah. So I was really missing, one, I was missing being on stage and just being with artists, being in that space. So there's a bit of that, and I was getting tired of being in quarantine, but also at the same time, like, I'm lucky. I was lucky to have a position where I can work remote, and a lot of my friends that make their living off of being artists and were scraping by to begin with. That whole industry, got cut down, and then my friends in the medical industry, like that just got into trying to help, are now being flooded with so much going on. So it was, I want to say last April or May or so, right sort of at the crux between, the pandemic coming up, the quarantine in full effect, and then the George Floyd protests kicking off. I was really in a position where I was just like, needed to communicate how I felt in that exact moment. And that's what City Don't Sing ended up being. And, you know, it's sort of in contrast to a lot of my other personal work. It's very, very stripped down. It's just me and guitar. And guitar is not my best instrument by far.
It's a beautiful track. And it's also on Apple Music and I think Spotify and stuff as well, correct?
Mm-hmm.
We'll put a link in our show notes.
Yeah, we definitely will. But I'm really glad that you brought that up, because one of the things that I feel like 2020 in particular, this is the first real show where we've had an opportunity to talk about, is an opportunity for, I think, a lot of us to reflect on what's actually important. And a lot happened. I mean, we could say that it was all bad or whatever, but I think there's a certain kind of realignment that a lot of us have had to do, no matter how privileged or lucky we were. And I'm not saying it was a good thing, but I think there were some things that came out of it. And, you know, I've had a lot of artist friends, like you said, lose their livelihood. But I hope that what comes out of this is growth and new opportunity when we can finally get back to normal, which whenever that's going to be.
Yeah, I think we're kind of slowly creating our new normal now too. So, and yeah, the silver lining is always the you know, despite all of the horrible things that going around the world, there is some good, I think, in 2020. So yeah, it's not all bad.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is that the old normal wasn't that great. We were just used to it, and that's kind of one of those things where we.
That's a good point.
Yeah, you know, I just put out a poem today that, you know, we especially as Americans, we're kind of taught from a young age to equate discomfort with suffering, and it holds us back as a society, as individuals. You know, we don't like doing things that make us uncomfortable, and we've never liked doing that as a country. And so when you look at what happened at the Capitol last week, that's a direct result of people being too uncomfortable to, you know, call something what it is, to say like, hey, there are white supremacists in our, like, these things that we're just like really reticent to name because it's uncomfortable, because we don't want to do that work. It leads exactly to sort of where we were at. And so, you know, I do hope that we find a new normal, and I hope we find a braver normal where we can brave some of that discomfort for the sake of the people who are actually suffering, and not equate our discomfort with that suffering.
That's an excellent message.
I think I agree. And I, as a white guy, I can only take the conversation so far, but I will say I've been able to have conversations with people that probably a year or two ago would have been just completely, you just couldn't open the conversation, because you're right, it makes people too uncomfortable to talk about. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not going to use our platform here today to like pretend to be kind of any kind of authority on it, but I do hope that the difficult conversations start to happen and we can make amends for many hundreds of years of not such great decisions, to put it simply.
Anyways, on a more horrible note here. Let's take a jump back over to the Splice soundtrack, and later on, after the soundtrack was released, Algorithms and Angelology was released, and that contains, I believe, 4 tracks? 5 tracks?
Yeah, four tracks and then a Reflection, yeah. So 5 tracks in total.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we have a track here that I'd like to listen to. It's called Ganymede. So let's take a listen, and we'll be right back. That was Ganymede, composed by Dain Saint for Splice on the Algorithms and Angelology Epilogue OST.
Yeah, and you mentioned this earlier, Dain, that there's 4 extra chapters or sequences that constitute the epilogue. This is a very uplifting and very triumphant track, but I'm curious, what is the significance of both the epilogue and maybe the individual sequences? Just on a high level.
So on a high level, the main sequence, we wanted to make sure that you had a sense of accomplishment. You know, if you beat the main sequence, you have beaten the game. Congratulations, you finished it, right? But in our sense, you know, as we were working on these puzzles, you know, they get a lot more complicated than what's in Cassiel. And so we wanted to have a space where it's like, hey, you know, now that you've beaten the game, if you really want to put your knowledge to the test, there's somewhere else for you to go, and that's the epilogue. And so the epilogue is basically just 4 sequences of the hardest puzzles that we could come up with. And they you know, Ariadne starts off, you know, pretty hard, and then by the time you get to like the last puzzle in Daedalus, it's just like it's very difficult. There's actually a video of it up on our YouTube channel of one of our interns at the time taking like the half hour it took to beat Daedalus.
Oh man.
And complete. All right, so they're really in depth. Ganymede. So the first 7 tracks are named after angels, but these 4 tracks are all named after humans from mythology. So this was meant to be sort of a messier experience, the epilogue. A lot more imperfect. The music is more recognizably like genre based, I would say. These are on the black keys, so it goes from Ariadne in A sharp, Ganymede is in G sharp, Philonoe is in F sharp, and Daedalus is in D sharp. So keeping that theme going. And then Ganymede here, it is Ganymede was a Trojan prince that was so beautiful that Zeus fell in love with his beauty and abducted him in the form of an eagle. And so it's this very like beautiful, triumphant track, you know, very heroic Trojan hero kind of smashing down the gates until you get to about 1:30 in, and it gets real dark for a second, like, and that's sort of, it was in my mind like, okay, Zeus takes the form of the eagle to come and abduct Ganymede so that he can be his cupbearer on Mount Olympus. And so there's this sort of feeling of, you know, this all 4 of these mythological humans kind of got their comeuppance from the gods in a way, and that was sort of my way of sort of communicating, like, this is what happens when you play around in God's domain, to go along with all of the same themes that we've been working with in the first half of it.
Wow, there's way more to this soundtrack than I ever could imagine. And it's such an amazing story about, you know, like even more so than the game appears. Like there's so much that you guys really thought about and kind of embedded into the work, and you know, it does show. Like there's something about your games that have this just otherworldly experience, and it shows. If you look at like Steam reviews, I mean, the overwhelming reviews, like positive reviews about like this game and across other platforms, just you guys did something right, and I think that definitely shows.
I gotta say, this is the first time we've talked to somebody who's presented us with a concept album to accompany a video game. I'm sure others exist, but I'm like thinking about all of the things that you've said about like the mythology and playing God, and it's like playing through in my head. Man. Yeah, like, it really recontextualizes the soundtrack for me in ways. Like I kind of got an inkling of it from the names, but now hearing you talk about it, it's like, that's deep.
Yeah. It's going to have I'm going to listen to it completely different next time. And so, yeah, wow. What a wild ride.
It's kind of fun that it's fun that I get to talk about this stuff, because like a lot of people are just like, oh, it's a cool puzzle game, and they just kind of move on. But yeah, I put way too much thought into everything I create. So it's cool to get a chance to talk about it.
That's super awesome. Yeah. So to kind of wrap up here, today we covered Splice on Mac, Windows, Linux, iPad, Android. Am I missing anything? PS4, PS3,
PS4, yeah.
Composed by Dain Saint of Cipher Prime Studios. This was just, like we just said, way more than I ever expected. And just a blast talking with you today, Dain.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. This has been fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah, we really appreciate it. We've been trying to get you on for like a month or two now, and just timing and stuff. And the end of last year was kind of a mess anyway, so it wouldn't have worked out anyway. But
the world sort of keeps exploding all of the time. So right. I'm glad that we were able to get a little bit of a lull at the beginning of the year, even though I can't even say that truthfully. But
true. Anyways, if you want to know more about the show, you can check us out online at pixelatedaudio.com for our show notes and the track list. We can also be found on Twitter at pixelatedaudio. If you like the show, leave comments or feedback. That's always appreciated. Dain, where can people find your music, your games, and you on your personal website?
Well, there's my personal website, dainsaint.com. That's DAINSAINT. Dain like rain, if that helps you remember it. The games are all at cipherprime.com, CIPHERPRIME. We got a ton of games. We just released our game Line Wait near the end of near the end of 2020, and that was just 5 beautiful motion stories that you can read through and feel some feelings. Trying to find some catharsis. And then if you want to keep up with what I'm doing on a more day-to-day basis, Instagram is probably the best place to do that. You can follow me on Instagram at Dain Saint. Post poems a couple times a week and do some videos and just silly stuff every now and then. So
awesome. And your YouTube stuff is pretty cool. You had a series where you were taking 4 notes and you were building up kind of how you felt about those notes. Can you mention anything about that? Or
yeah, that's the 4 Notes project. I was trying to sort of reconnect with my improvisational roots, and I was reading this book called Effortless Mastery. Beautiful book, and he sort of charges you to think that there are no bad notes, and so you can play any notes until you can hear what is beautiful about them. And so 4 Notes was sort of that. I set up a generator on my website, and it would generate 4 random notes at the beginning of the week. And I would just sort of sit down in front of a camera and play them until I could figure out what sounded beautiful about it to me. And so I did that for about 2 months and then kind of stopped. But the generator, I believe, is still up if people want to take that on as a challenge as well.
It looked pretty cool. Pretty interesting. Gene, any closing thoughts? Any closing comments?
Yes, actually, since you didn't mention it, make sure to check out Cipher Prime's Bandcamp, Cipher Prime Studios, where you can buy the albums for this and quite a number of other games. In fact, one thing I wanted to specify is you mentioned Shim Sham and a couple of other games. This whole set of soundtracks has been very piano focused, but Dain's got a wide variety. Like Shim Sham is like a vocal jazz album. It's almost nothing like this at all. So if you're interested in hearing the variety of music that he has, if you've liked the music here, go check that out. We'll have a link in our show notes. I've enjoyed it. I've bought quite a few of your albums, not just the ones for Splice, but in particular, I really like the one called Earthbound, which is just like your musings on traveling cross country by train.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
It's an interesting concept album. Oh, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, that album I do put on from time to time, just because I took a train from Philly to LA when we were going out for Indiecade some years back, and it's a 3-day journey, and I didn't have much else to do. You don't have internet, so I just kind of wrote a little travel journal, essentially. That was just how I felt as I was passing through all these different cities and locales in the country. And it was such a good experience that sometimes I'll just go back and put that album on just to bring that feeling of travel again. It's like a really nice thing to put in the background when I'm working. So yeah, I'm glad you like that Earthbound album. That's pretty cool.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I want to say before we end up here, you mentioned several times the hidden symbolism and stuff with like the number 7 and stuff like that. And just so happens that we are actually playing 7 tracks today, right?
I think so.
Yeah, I think, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. This last track, taking out the show here, is called Reflection. Any final words on this track, Dain, before we...
Yeah. So Reflection, every track, before Reflection is a track that appears in the album. It is written for 4 hands. It's this massively complicated thing. Reflection is just me. It's just, it was a one-shot improvised piece. And I just sat down at the piano and kind of brought to mind at the end of the project, like, how did I feel about creating this game, about Splice? And I wrote this song, Reflection. It's the only one that doesn't appear in the game, and it's the only one that doesn't appear in the sheet music, which is also available on our website. This is a very sort of personal piece.
Excellent. Dain, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It was a pleasure having you on, and looking forward to the next stuff that comes out of Cipher Prime and your music.
Thanks so much. Thanks. This has been a really great experience. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's been our pleasure.
Absolutely. So this is Reflection. Thank you everyone so much for listening. We'll see you back in a few weeks for the next episode.